What's up, everyone? Today we're going to go over how to attack your weak links in your training and how to transition from being injured to getting back into your training. So if someone gets injured, let's say you break your ankle, which is something that I've done twice, along with many other injuries that I've had in the past. But what typically happens is you start going to physical therapy after you wait a couple days, right? Or maybe even a couple weeks, depending on how severe your injury is. So you typically end up going to physical therapy, and from when you start physical therapy, depending on how harsh your injury is, there's gonna come a point where you can walk again and you're starting to regain your range of motion to some extent. And then you'll typically stop after around 6 weeks or so, if you even make it through all of your physical therapy. And then you're kind of put in a position where you just want to re-enter doing what you were doing, which for most people is going to be going back to their old weightlifting routine. And the thing that doesn't help with that is your regular cookie cutter weightlifting programs that everyone typically does, 95% of people, they will not address or continue to progress your weak links in your ankles, knees, hips, shoulders, elbows, wrists, etc., or your spine. So if you've already had injuries, the programs that you are currently doing are not going to bring you back up to speed if you want to get back into things like jumping, twisting, landing from a elevated surface, or getting back into more active activities such as sports, martial arts, things of that nature, right? Because if you go straight from just doing simple mobility exercises and then you want to go back and try to play a basketball game or something like that, there's going to be a disconnect there. And this is something that I dealt with my ankle, because the traditional approach, and things have changed, right? But it's very much the same to this day. So I broke my ankle, and then it's just typically like an ACL or something like that. They look at it on a timeline. Oh, that'll take 8 months to recover, or whatever the deal is. And for mine, they go, okay, about 6 to 8 weeks, right? So I did all my physical therapy, and I still had swelling. I could tell I was significantly weaker on that side in that ankle. And so when I came to return to activity, I just went right back into playing basketball. And what happened was, I went from being a 1-foot jumper, because that was my jumping leg. Then I had to go to a 2-foot jumper because I wasn't very confident that my ankle could hold up. Lateral movement, became something that was kind of fearful for me, because I could just tell my ankle was not as strong as it used to be. So as I progressed and continued only weightlifting, it didn't really get any stronger. And then eventually, when I tried to get back into doing more active things like running, sprinting, etc., I was starting to have issues. So it's important to realize that your weak links are always going to be there unless you address them. So it's typically way more simple than you think, but what gets people off put or on the wrong base is that they think that their weightlifting program is going to compensate for all of their issues, and that's just not the case, right? You have to address why you got that in the first place. So my ankles were already weak and immobile before I got injured, and I can tell you why that is. And oftentimes it's the chicken or the egg. It either starts at the bottom of the kinetic chain or the top of the kinetic chain. So in the ankle, it's going to be the fact that your toes and feet are always trapped inside of your shoe, and when you are constantly doing things with the same impact, like running, jumping, basketball, right, that's going to cause overuse injury over time, especially with how active that I was. So what I do now and how I've addressed it in my training going forward is simply by regressing things. So instead of just hopping on a calf machine and trying to do reps till you're blue in the face, it's not about stimulating the muscle as much as it is becoming strong through every range of motion as well as taking your body through range of motions that it typically does not go through, because that is where the injuries are stemming from. And like I said, you start at the bottom of the kinetic chain, so you'll be working the ankle directly. And physical therapy, this is typically the route they take. They're gonna do all of your ankle rehab exercises, but what often doesn't get addressed is the top of the kinetic chain. So in this video, it basically means the hip. So it's like the chicken or the egg. Is it the ankle problem, or did the ankle problem happen because of a problem farther up the chain? And typically in ankle injuries, it'll come from inactive glutes, tight hips, etc., which stiffen the knee, which put the ankle in a vulnerable position. So there's not really a way that you can only address the ankle issue. You have to address everything. And this is why you have to have an all-encompassing training program, because you could spend years only working on the ankle, but if you never address the hips as well, things typically aren't going to get better, because the body does not work in isolation like you've been kind of programmed to think just through all of these years of doing traditional weightlifting, where you're doing, I'm working my biceps today and I'm working my back today. And that's typically thought of in a bodybuilding sense, but that is very different than what we're doing. What we want to do is take every joint through every range of motion every week. And I like to work everything most days. And this isn't, once again, like a traditional bodybuilding routine, like I'm just gonna press until I can't press anymore. It's gonna be a little different. So as in a traditional weightlifting program, you're gonna do your bench press, your incline press, your shoulder press, and that's pretty much gonna be the day. Maybe throw some chest flies in there, whatever. But how I'm using it in this context is we want to press in every area. So you need to be able to hold yourself with your arms behind you in like a tabletop position. That's going to be the farthest back the shoulders move right here. And then you hit your dips straight down, press, handstand, and ultimately back bend. So you're getting the entire range of the shoulder. Because when you only stay in front of you, then you're going to get the rolled forward shoulders. Hands are going to turn in, which really affects your bicep tightness, which affects the elbow, which affects the wrist, which affects the shoulder. It's all together, right? So there's certain areas and there's certain ways that your body moves that is not incorporated into your traditional programs. And this is the issue for weak links. So same with the ankles. In a traditional program, you're not really going to work your ankles more than doing simple calf raises, whether that is weighted or body weight. But once again, the issue is that you're not working everything from every angle. Your ankles need to rotate inward and outward. They need to be able to flex up with your tibialis. Your toes need to be able to flex up, as well as being able to push up with the calf and balance on the balls of your toes. So these were some things that were left out of my ankle rehab that I know now in hindsight that I should have been doing the entire time. So in addition to that, once you are able to balance pretty well, and when you're able to balance, you're going to start to restore connection to your calf muscle and to your feet. When your feet are constantly jammed into a shoe, which acts more as a cast or a brace, which meaning it's basically taking the working stress and response away from that muscle. So instead of the muscles learning to stimulate and place the foot correctly, your shoe is taking over some of that stress. So then when we get out of the shoe, then that's when you have people's ankles that cave in, or they end up with flat feet, collapsed arches, plantar fasciitis, which I've also had, all of those things. But that was because the only way I was addressing my ankles was in a calf raise, like on a calf raise machine. So you're not really addressing the tendons, you're not addressing the internal, the external, you're not addressing the tibialis or balance. And then after balance, then you can progress into the jumping. It starts with the 2-foot pogo jumps, where you're just on the balls of your feet, just hitting the ground and popping back up. That will start to restore that Achilles area. And then once you are good with the 2 feet, you move to the 1 foot pogo hop. And yeah, that's just when you're on the ball of your foot with one leg and you're just jumping up and down. And what you're doing is training your body and ankle, heel, arch area to absorb that impact and pop right up. So that is very good for developing that ankle resilience. And so these are the things that I do nowadays, and just getting outside of that typical bodybuilding routine. You know, I would go into the gym, have pain, and then continue to do the exercises that were not making me better. You know, they might add a little bit of size to your frame over time, but what happens is, because you can't continue to perform like that without getting pain, you inevitably have to stop. So you're most likely going to lose that size you're working so hard for anyway. So I always say it makes way more sense to build your foundation, and you can take a proper foundation into any area of movement. But if you stick with one, then you're going to be hindered in every other area. So for example, if I can move in every single way I need to move, and my shoulders aren't clicking and wonking, and my ankles and hips are all moving correctly, I can go play basketball, I can sprint, I can do martial arts, I can do all these things. But when I was a bodybuilder, powerlifter type, when I was built more like a fridge, I couldn't twist very well, my overhead mobility was very poor, and my hips were very tight. If I take that body and I go into these same athletic events, whether it's martial arts, basketball, whatever, that activity is going to force me to be in positions that I don't train for. You know, I'm going to have to move laterally, I'm going to have to twist, I'm going to have to bend backwards, I'm going to have to go over my head and jump and do all these things. But if your body's not ready for that, that is when the injuries come. It's being placed in a position that you're not ready for, or that you haven't trained for. And this is what happens when boxers, or rather weightlifters, go to hit the heavy bag or do boxing workouts, or they go play basketball. Anything dealing with rhythm or using the body as a whole, they are going to suffer at, because they are working everything in isolation all the time. There isn't that whole body connection. So if you see a martial artist and they're punching and they're kicking and they're doing their work, everything looks fluid, everything is connected. But if you take someone that's used to working in isolation in bodybuilding and powerlifting, etc., you have them go hit the heavy bag, you're going to see a very different picture. It's going to be very mechanic. It's going to be like vroom, vroom. And it doesn't look good. Their body's not working as one. And those are the people that are going to tear their bicep, tear their chest, because their body's not ready for that type of impact. It's very different. It's highly more stressed on your tendons, and just being injury resilient, because if you are only working chest flies in a very controlled manner, and then you go to the heavy bag and you try to throw a wild looping hook and you hit that bag in a certain way that you haven't been training for, then then that bicep goes. And I've seen that happen with even other trainers I've been around. I've seen it with clients, I've seen it with athletes, and you just have to train up to that point. It's very easy to think, oh, I did this when I was a kid, but that could end up being 10, 15 years ago sometimes, and you've just been sedentary in the meantime. So that's not what we want. So yeah, the lesson here is to just bridge that gap between being completely injured and out of activity, and then going back into what you've been doing, which is typically a weightlifting routine. So you got to bridge the gap in between and realize where you're failing, where you've been weak, because otherwise you're going to end up straight back on that injury cycle. I get injured, I do a little rehab, I go back into what I was doing, I try to do an activity that I want, I ultimately get hurt, and I'm back to square one because I didn't rehab it properly, and my training is not sufficient for getting me back to where I need to be. So the best way to do it is just build the foundation and then just slowly build on that. And then you don't have to worry about injury. You're still gonna have a good physique, and you've built the habits that you need to have, instead of being one of these people at like 40, 50, 60 that's been training their whole life, but they've been training wrong. So they don't have a good physique because they're constantly out of the gym. Their body feels worse than it did when they started training, etc., so on. So you want to make your time worth it. You want your program to be able to do everything it needs to do for you. And like I've said a million times, it's just moving your body in every way that it should move. If you only work in a typical bodybuilding fashion, you are not going to get that. And you're typically going to be focusing on things that don't benefit you that much, like putting on a very minuscule amount of size over the years. You can still put on size, but you can be healthy when you do it. If you want to learn more about how I train, etc., feel free to shoot me a message. You know, this is the type of stuff that I love to work with people. Changing that mindset a little bit, getting them back into activities, feeling confident about it, and getting out of that paradigm of just boring, grinder moves that typically everyone does while they're weightlifting. So add a little bit of joy back into your training and actually get your body healthy so you can move how you want to move.